Hey, welcome back to another dispatch from Hollie McKay. Hollie's just back from, of all places, Afghanistan. And so you just went there to go check up on the place and gone for, I think, a couple of weeks. What did you find?
Well, first of all, it was important for me to be able to go back and to sort of see my friends and to really see a place that I love in the world and to sort of see what is happening there. And yeah, it was certainly a roller coaster of experience going back. So many ups and many downs, to say the least. Um,
Okay.
in terms of what I found is, it's hard to sort of say because when you go somewhere like Kabul, it's still very busy. There's a lot of traffic. The markets are there. People are everywhere. A lot of the restaurants are sort of reopened, and a lot of the businesses that were there before have all sort of gone back running. But there's certainly a sort of a different vibe in the street that, as much as it's bustling, there's certain. I think there's still a certain fear factor, and certainly one thing I very much observed, sort of as a journalist and as a foreigner, is just how increasingly challenging it is to work there, and increasingly challenging it is to work sort of under the Taliban regime, and the increase in sort of skepticism, and quite frankly, there really aren't too many foreign journalists that are sort of still in the country. A few Europeans that kind of come and go, but it is that sort of bit of a black hole, and you certainly can see why, because for me, it was certainly a frustrating sort of place to work in terms of the amount of permissions that you have to get. And intelligence has to even clear you to work, and you have to get permission from the foreign ministry. And every time you go to a province, you have to visit the province. But then when you go out, most of the Taliban foot soldiers, they look at the letter and it means nothing to them. And so then you sort of go through all this rigmarole again, and it's really a deeply challenging place to work, and so much more so than when I was there a year ago.
Yeah, well, as I recall, a year ago, being issued the very same letter, basically made it so you could drive all the way around the country unimpeded. And it sounds like over the course of the last year, all of that has turned back into a series of local controls that are much tighter. What were some of the ups?
Certainly seeing, my beloved fixer, who's a very good friend of mine, Naweed. It was great to be able to work with him again and to sort of sit down and brainstorm different stories. I really, on this trip, I haven't done any writing on the actual trip. It was really just collecting the information and sort of doing the work. And now I'm in this very laborious process of putting together a number of articles. But it gave me a real chance to be able to just sort of be in the moment, which I haven't been able to do in Afghanistan because I've always been sort of working during the day and going home and transcribing and filing, and everything's sort of been up to the minute. But this year I made that decision for my trip to really just focus on the material and absorbing being in there, and then leaving the sort of writing part to when I came home. So that was a real up for me, was to be able to sort of be in the moment and to be in a place that I love, regardless of whoever is in control. Afghanistan is still very much a place that I love and want to continue to go back to. Go to some of my favorite restaurants, Sufi and Herat, and still smoke shisha quietly in the family area despite its ban. And have the food that I love and the yogurt that I love, and I think really just the simple things is really what I appreciate about Afghanistan. And it is such a unique place to work. It is, just especially you feel like you're sort of part of this sort of incredible vacuum of history in a way that, and to sort of be able to be on the ground and to document it and to be with people. And it really is just, it still is this pinch me moment where I feel so grateful for my job, and to have the opportunity in life to be able to be on the ground and to talk to people and to sort of live this experience that I know so many other people don't or aren't able to. And so, I think that is a real privilege and something that I love despite the hardships.
Yeah, well, it's very Hemingway in the way that it is put together, and it is a unique opportunity because, as you point out, for most other people on this planet, it's a bit of a mystery, and for many people, they carry preconceptions of that it is a dangerous mystery on top of what it is. But you have your places there, which is really, really cool. And I'm not going to get to the content of some of the stuff that you found yet, but tell me about some of the downs that you ran into this time.
Well, I think first of all, just sort of give you a little bit of context. So I arrived early on a Friday, and Friday is the one weekend day Afghans have. They just have one day of the week, and Friday is the prayer day and the weekend day where the things of buildings and government is closed. So to give you some context, I arrived early on Friday morning. And you sort of immediately when you get there, you feel a different sense of control. There was somebody pulled me from the line and I had to do a foreign registration and all these sort of new protocols the Taliban has in place to definitely keep an eye on foreigners. So you sort of have this extra layer of scrutiny on you constantly. But I was very happy to have made the long journey, and I had a long layover, and to sort of get there and to be back in Kabul. And as soon as I got there, I went to my guest house, and Naweed and I went to Herat, and we were just sort of sitting there and sort of laughing a little bit about the journey and being back. And the next minute, you just hear this huge explosion, and we just looked at each other, and it's sort of you made a joke Tuesday in Kabul, but really that's what it is. And there was a massive suicide bomb just sort of around the corner at a mosque. And so, that just sort of is this sort of reality check of the situation that you were dealing with, and this sort of blanket of insecurity that can sort of be erupted at any time. And certainly throughout my time there were a number of suicide bombings, and that is always, it's a hard thing. Afghans just get along with it, but I think it was always sort of a hard thing to fathom, and it really does start to make you think a lot about life and how quickly that can be kind of taken away at any point. And I think Afghans, in many ways, they sort of just live on luck. And even though the war is technically over, it's certainly a place that, as much as the Taliban want us to think that they have everything under control, that is certainly not the reality on the ground. So, with that, it comes a lot of I think, challenges working. I was detained twice, but kind of go into that more in my stories. But that was not a pleasant experience, even though I have been detained once before. This time it certainly felt very different. I had certainly done everything right in terms of obtaining the permissions that I needed to get, but that still wasn't enough. For a lot of the Taliban that don't, understand what these letters are, or, in one of my cases, thought my Fitbit was a spy watch, and they broke it in the end. So I wasn't happy about that, but it's certainly not pleasant to have all your things taken off you. My passport, my phone, everything was sort of taken. And then you kind of just left there to their mercy and transferred from place to place. So it's certainly a uniquely unpleasant experience that highlights the challenges of working there. And then I guess, with some of the downs is you are constantly, at least in the story that I was pursuing, you're constantly dealing with death and destruction. And of my last few days there, the horrible suicide bomb on the Hazara community, these young girls, 17 to 20, that were sitting their practice exam for university, and were attacked. Nobody's claimed responsibility, but of course ISIS has attacked the Hazaras a lot, but they've also been persecuted by the previous Taliban administration as well. And just to sort of to see, all those bodies being taken to emergency hospital, and then to kind of be with these girls, and they're sort of screaming and wailing, and the Taliban is sort of laughing at them. And then when I go to try to talk to the Taliban, they detain me. So it's just challenging, to say the least. But having said all of that, Afghanistan still has an incredibly special place in my heart. I'm already sort of planning when I can go there again, because it is just a place that I do really love.
Yeah, well, I don't think there's very many people that can actually navigate that with all those difficulties. And it's certainly a credit to your ability to stay focused in the middle of these kinds of situations, that you are able to keep working. So yeah, I'll leave the mention of some of the things that you talked about as far as stories are concerned until you actually write them. But I wanted to ask you, you visited a children's hospital while you were there, and I know you've been involved with that stuff forever. How was this visit in comparison to the previous ones?
I mean, the health situation in Afghanistan has long been terrible, really. Despite all the money again that's been poured in from the US and from other NGOs, so much of it was just sort of wasted away by corruption, and it often never got to where it really needed to go. So the health sector has always been a huge challenge in Afghanistan, especially maternity clinics. Um, One thing that seemed apparent to me when I talked to different people and the doctors and different workers is that the health sector is really one area the Taliban hasn't touched. So while they've put a lot of restrictions on education and other sectors, the health sector, the Taliban at least have been smart enough to know that they can't sort of interfere with that. So the health sector is essentially running as normal, but what is normal really in Afghanistan? It's still quite tragic. And I went to the maternity hospital, Malai, that's sort of the local public hospital really, and just the level of babies that are stillborn or that are born in just really very, very unhealthy sort of conditions, and you go into this sort of special ward for the very sick children, and there's not even enough beds. They sort of put them into these giant sort of tubs, if you will. And I just, it was difficult for me. I felt very unprofessional. I absolutely broke down because you have these tiny little lifeless beings, and you have to really just stop and think about what it means to freeze funds as the US has done. And I felt very grateful they told me that the ICRC was supposed to be now funding the hospital since the fall of last year when those government funds were frozen, that the ICRC has sort of stepped up to sort of fully fund the hospital, which I was just terribly grateful for. And I can say the same thing for emergency. After a number of the bombings, and without emergency, which is the sort of big hospital in Shara now for the war wounded, I think Kabul would really be a darker place, because that is where the injured go for that sort of life-saving surgery, and there really is no equivalent in Kabul for that. So it's still a place that is very much reliant on outside NGOs, and I found myself just very, very grateful for those particular NGOs and for the work that they're continuing to do in Afghanistan, and not abandoning Afghans, because I think it's easy to sort of sit back and sort of say they didn't fight, they've got to fix themselves, all of this. And I've certainly been in that position of frustration myself. But when you're there and you just sort of see regular Afghans trying to get by in life, it's really searing to think about how we have turned our backs on them.
Yeah, well, when you look at the humanity of it face to face, it does take all of the politics and the global strategy and all the rest of that kind of stuff just falls by the wayside, and all you see is an individual human being struggling to stay alive. Last question. Just going back to the fact that the randomness of violence that you encountered there, what's your assessment of who's really how in control is this new government of this place after a year, and who's challenging them? Is it just one group? Is it multiple groups? Or is it faction fighting in between people within the same ruling group? What's going on there?
Well, first of all, I think that certainly ISIS-K is making its mark and is targeting, whatever civilians. They're a very, very brutal group that are doing that. But the Taliban doesn't even want to acknowledge their existence. They, when I ask about it, they just sort of say, oh, they're criminals. And they certainly want to project this image of full control. And they also make it very difficult to, investigate when these bombings happen. They don't let press anywhere near. They sort of issue these very blanket statements without a lot of detail, and it becomes really impossible to get to the bottom of it. You also have to sort of raise the speculative question of, the Taliban isn't a monolithic entity. There are certainly different divisions within the Taliban that want different things. So I think it's not wrong to question, again, there isn't certifiable proof, but to question, could it be other factions within the Taliban that are not getting what it wants? Is the Pakistani element of it certainly isn't getting what it wants? And how far are some of the dissident aspects willing to go to kind of, destabilize the regime, if you will? And there's certainly a big spotlight, I think, on the fractious nature of the Taliban itself, and how much can be attributed to ISIS-K and potentially how much can be attributed to other groups. So I think there's a lot of unanswered questions when it comes to Afghanistan, and I certainly hope in the pieces that I put out that I can piece together, I think, a lot of what is and what isn't happening. I think that there are a lot of still aspects to look at, and yeah, stay tuned. I've got a lot of different interesting sort of pieces on looking at the Hazara community and also the future of women, and how it's a lot more nuanced, I think, than what we're seeing in the press, which generally just focuses on education and lack of work. There is sort of a lot more to it than that. I've looked into the mining sector as something that Taliban has really finally realized the value of, and especially the coal industry there. And Afghanistan has has really great quality coal, and I think the Taliban are really they're very smart about their ability to understand what they're actually sitting on, and then with that, looking at the relationship with China and other countries and what their role is. And again, it's not what you're necessarily hearing. I don't necessarily think the Taliban and China relationship is particularly cozy, and I'll sort of go into detail about why that is. I'm looking at the economy sort of in underground groups that are working. I'm looking at underground education. I was fortunate enough to go to a school where girls are being taught sort of underground, and sort of why that is. Also I did some exclusive interviews with the Host governor, who's actually one of the Gitmo 5. And ironically enough, he was the one who got me out of detainment when the Taliban detained me. So it's just, it is this very bizarre world. Also, the Justice Ministry that I went to in Kabul as well, to sort of talk to them about how the justice system has changed and when they plan to impose a lot of the very stringent Sharia law. And just a little bit about my experience being there, even trying to get in. The security guard that insisted I was naked because he could see my face. So, just the fighting and the endless kind of stress it is just to sort of get the story is I want to be able to bring readers a little bit into that backstory. So I have a good series of stories coming out. So I hope that people stay tuned.
Oh, I think people will stay tuned. And I will say this in closing this particular interview, the stories that you are working on now probably constitute some of the most valuable original source material on Afghanistan that is going to be produced this year. And I really do mean that, because from a value of information and an intelligence gathering perspective, I mean, only being on the ground, and there's so few people on the ground right now that are covering this kind of stuff from the point of view of the very many aspects that you are. So, like, good on you, Hollie, and the fact that you went back there to go check on this place and make sure that it's not forgotten and its people are not forgotten is a very worthy thing to be on the lookout for more indeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis.